Okay, hey Lance. All right, so we want to talk about the consistent, secure RBAC effort. Um, where do we want to collect this on the pop-up Etherpad or on this one?
Doesn't matter, whatever's easiest for folks.
Um, I guess let's just do it right here. Okay. All right. So we started looking at this last cycle and didn't get too far because there are some complications. Um, so roughly. Just put out down some things we need to talk about, and then we can talk about them. So the first thing, we need some agreement on what we're implementing, which we pretty much have. So that's in natural language. And I got to patch up somewhere. Here we go. Okay, so the first thing is I've got this enormous policy matrix thing up. I think we're going to have to break up how we review this thing. But it basically explains the idea of this project with different personas that can be implemented across all the services, and then how our API calls are supposed to behave. And then just as there's some policies in there that we have to deprecate and replace with newer policies. Because for a few of the micro versions that got implemented, there was one policy that allows you to do basically CRUD on this particular thing. And we want to be able to, so the goal of this roughly is to make it possible to have read-only users, both in like user space and admin space, roughly. So we need to be able to separate out creation and updates from reads and writes. Well, writes or creation. Okay, so we've got the big set of policies, and then what we've found, so the new stuff that we're trying to implement is to take advantage of scoping that was introduced into Keystone in like Queens or something. So what the scoping allows you to do is it gives you another dimension on the token that you get. And so the policy language is sophisticated enough to be able to tell whether the token has a particular scope or not. So in addition to having roles, you also have scopes. So the real administrator will have system scope, right? Is what it's called. Whereas regular end users will only have project level scopes. And then there's this domain scoping in the middle that we're not going to deal with at all because we got enough other stuff to do. So project scope tokens are the ones we're used to dealing with. And so it's scoped to a particular project. So there would be a project ID associated with it and all that kind of stuff makes sense. Now, one of the problems we've run into in this is that to have a purely system scope token, it's not tied to any project. And so, theoretically that makes sense. But the problem with Cinder is that our API structure for the URLs requires there to be a project ID in the URL. And so if you request a system scope token in your service catalog, we're getting nothing for the project scopes. And so we need to solve that problem in some way that makes sense. The other thing is, as you go through our API, right, the role of the project ID that appears in the URL Sometimes it makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. So it sort of makes sense if you're asking about the volumes that are owned by a particular project. But when an administrator currently goes to ask to list volumes, they have to have their project ID in the URL. And then it doesn't really make sense that because none of the volumes, well, a lot of the volumes that they're going to get in the response have nothing to do with the project ID that's in the URL. I don't know if that was clear, but anyway, so we've got to, I think what we want to do in Xena is to implement the scoping correctly and not do this kind of fake thing with having the administrator role be tied to a project. Does that make sense, Lance? Or am I?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. All right. So,
So, Ryan, one question around this. Where are the system, like when we request a resource from system admin, when which project it's going to end up in?
so I'm sorry. So can you give me a use case real quick? So like you're creating a volume or something as an administrator?
Yeah, as a system admin, I'm creating a volume. So where does it go? Like, it doesn't belong to any project. Like, I mean, I'm not sure. Like, is it normal in this?
So currently as an admin, can you create a volume for some other project? So if you do a post and you have the other project's ID in the URL, are you allowed to create?
Yeah, I haven't tried this one.
Because see, I think one way of looking at it, if the administrator needs to make volumes for some project, then they'd need a project scope token to do that. So like you could do like this kind of thing where you create a bunch of volumes in advance and then create volume transfers to the particular projects you want to do it to. You would still have to create them in some project to hold them. So there aren't any free-floating resources.
I think what you said, Brian, makes sense to me. As in, if you're an administrator and you get a system scope token, then you are not bound to any project. Then you cannot create volumes. Because resources need a project. So if you want to do for one specific, get a token for that project, and then you make the request. But otherwise, it doesn't make too much sense to have a system-wide one, maybe.
If that was my understanding, that resources are bound to projects, and
so the Cinder obviously isn't unique in this case. This is very applicable to like Nova and Neutron, right? Like if I want to go reboot a server, do I have to have a project scope token to do that?
Right.
Or does all of Nova need to be refactored to remove all of those places in its code where it checks context.project ID exists, right? Like that's going to be a lot of invasive refactors to Nova, Neutron, Cinder, Glance, like because project ID has been around forever and everything pretty much bubbles up to a project, it's going to be a big problem. So I'm not sure if anybody here was in the session yesterday that we were kind of working to talk about this, but we came up with 3 different solutions to that. Well, there's more than 3, but we focused on client-specific solutions, but I can highlight the other ones. So if you look in the Etherpad, the other Etherpad, right around line 133 where the Nova session is. There's one solution. I'll start with the worst and then kind of work towards what we've found as the most reasonable. So the first solution would be have Nova, Neutron, Cinder, Glance, every service formally adopt system scope as a first-class citizen, which could mean database schema changes to relax non-nullable constraints on project ID columns, right, in your database. You know, like you're talking about a lot of changes to code all up and down Cinder that would have to deal with project ID being none, which has never happened before. That's the first option, and we ruled that out. The second option was implement an API in Keystone that lets a system administrator exchange their token for a token scoped to a project without an explicit role assignment. So let me work on this. Here's my token, give me a token scoped to this. So it's kind of like almost a way to impersonate authorization, right? We kind of ruled that out too because it's going to require API changes in Keystone. So then we get into 3 other solutions that are all client side. The third one is, or the first of the client solutions is to bookend project specific operations with role assignment modifications. So as a system administrator, if I need to go create a volume in a project, my client is going to figure that out, give me a role on that project using my system scoped token, get me a project scoped token, and then do the request to Cinder like it normally would. And then on the way out the door, clean up that role assignment. So that's option number 1. Option number 2 would be to use a construct in Keystone that would allow role assignments to be inherited down a tree of projects. So if you're unfamiliar, Keystone obviously supports hierarchical projects, and they all bubble up to a domain. You can have multiple domains, which means you can have multiple project trees, but all of your system users would have a role on those domains, and it would be inherited. So they could essentially do the same workflow as approach number 1, but without the explicit authorization created by that role assignment. So you could just say, give me that role assignment. It's effectively there, and they do the same thing with a project scoped token in Cinder. The third approach is to allow clients to specify an HTTPX project ID pass-through header. So this is a header that Keystone already sets in middleware. So in front of Cinder, right, you have Keystone middleware, and it peels the token off the request, puts it back to Keystone, validates it, pulls the project, the system, the domain, the user, all of this information out of the token response, and it sets these headers, right? And then it shuffles that request down the pipeline, and then eventually Oslo Context gets it, and it creates this context object from that request environment. Right now, Keystone middleware scrubs and sanitizes all of the headers that it might set to prevent forgery, so that a user can't say, I want to work on this project, I'm going to set this header. What we're considering is to allow system administrators, like when Keystone middleware validates that token and sees, yep, this is a system administrator, they have a role on the system, and they've also supplied HTTPX project ID in the header, I'm going to keep that. And I'm going to throw that in the request and keep it going down the pipeline. So what this would do is it would reuse all of the stuff that already exists in Oslo Context to create a context object that would give you a project ID and a system scope attribute and all the roles from the system user. So that's the third approach. So then the advantages and disadvantages of each. The first approach with the explicit role assignments is that it leaves a very verbose audit trail, which can be nice, but it's also extremely chatty. Like you're doing a lot of operations in Keystone just for people to be able to do things with one volume in Cinder. So that's going to increase the amount of time that people have to wait just to create a volume or reboot a server. It also doesn't, like, we're not sure how to handle the cleanup of roles. Like, I don't know how long Brian wants to administer volumes for somebody, right? Like, is he going to keep that role assignment around for a day? Does he only need it for one operation? Like, is he going to start with a clean slate on January 1st, and then by the time Christmas rolls around, he's got 800 role assignments because he's been cleaning things up for people? Like, we don't know how best to handle that and what the right answer is. The other problem is that it's not going to work for projects that have already been deleted. So it kind of fails with the, like, I need to go clean up resources in a project if that project's already been deleted, which sucks, but it does happen in the real world, right? So then approach number 2, it's less chatty, but it requires more process. Like Keystone Manage is going to have to make sure that those assignments exist when Keystone's installed, or you're going to have some process when you onboard your new operators to make sure that they have the same roles that they have on the system on all of these domains. Anytime you bootstrap a new customer that, you know, is given a domain of their own, like, you need to make sure that all your operators have roles on that domain. So it feels like more cognitive overhead for your operators when they're doing this stuff, right? In order for it to work as intended. And it still doesn't, it's still susceptible to the case where the project is deleted. You can't go clean up the resources. So the advantages of approach number 3, it's less chatty because there is no extra API calls to Keystone. It doesn't require an explicit role assignment, and it doesn't require a project scoped token. We're just setting a project ID on a system scoped context ultimately, and making that available through all of the existing plumbing in Keystone middleware and Oslo context. So as Cinder developers, you still just have a context object that just still has a project ID. You'll just need to be aware of, like, the fact that it's not a mutually exclusive set between project ID, domain ID, and system. This is the first time that this is ever going to happen. Like, that's always because we never have been able to overload scopes within a token, and this would be like the first time that we've ever kind of allowed that to happen. But one of the other advantages is that roles from the actual system scoped token are applied to your project, the project that's in the pass-through. This is nice because it works automatically for system readers. System readers don't have the ability to write anything, so they can't create assignments. So approach number 1 fails for them. They can't give themselves authorization on a project because they don't have any write permissions. But with approach number 3, if they supply this pass-through header, and if Keystone middleware validates that appropriately, then they get the reader role automatically on that project without an explicit role assignment and without any extra authorization to manage role assignments. And it's possible to set that project ID to whatever. So we need to figure out if this is going to be something that we validate. Like, does the project have to exist? And I think it's going to depend on the case, because we could use this to clean things up. Like, for delete cases, do we validate that that project is actually in Keystone? If it's not, do we care? Like, should we just clean up the volume anyway, right? But for create cases, maybe we do care, right? Like, if an admin's going to create a volume for a project, should Cinder put that on the wire to Keystone and say, does this project exist? Okay, cool, right? And then for auditing cases, like Nova has this problem where a lot of their notification machinery assumes that the context project ID is always present. So when somebody goes to list all servers with a system scoped token, that auditing comes out to be as none because there's no project ID associated to that context. So for this case, they could supply a special, like, Sentinel UUID that is synonymous with system scope, and it would be like a mental mapping. Like, you'd have to know that it means something special, but it would be useful there too. So those are the 3 approaches, the 3 preferred approaches of the 5. The first 2 being a lot of work, and the last 3 being the preferred ones because they would live in the client. And this would be just for system users, right? Like people who are adminning the deployment and doing all of that kind of stuff, right? This isn't really, like, we wouldn't expose any of this functionality to project users at all. This project users have the headers completely scrubbed, and that always has to come from the token. Thoughts, comments, questions, concerns?
So if I understand the idea correctly, like with the system scope request, we need to pass project ID, and that will be used to create the context, right?
Yep. So the Cinder client or OpenStack client would figure out what that project ID is supposed to be, and then it would set that in the HTTP X project ID header, and then ship that along to Cinder with a system scoped token. And then in Cinder's API, like, you don't have to do anything really. When you go to consume that context object, it'll just have a project ID already there for you because you're using all of the existing libraries to populate that context.
And that, if I understood correctly, that would only be necessary for requests that actually need a project ID. If we have some kind of request that doesn't use the project ID, we wouldn't need in applying to pass that when we are using system scopes, right?
Correct. Yep. Ideally, like, that kind of goes to like the first option where it was like to consume system scope, we would ideally not have to have this project ID everywhere, but we're finding out like it's absolutely everywhere in all of our code because it's been there since the beginning, right? And we never really thought it was going to change. So, but yeah, if you develop a new API for a resource that's system specific and it doesn't belong to projects at all, and you never store anything about that project ID or consume a project ID out the context, then operators wouldn't have to supply that at all, or we wouldn't need corresponding client changes to set that special header for that case.
Mm-hmm. Because I think Rajat implemented a feature that precisely we had to do something that we didn't like a lot because it was basically you can change the default type. As a system administrator, you can change the default type or for a specific project. But so if you didn't have the project, so it was weird that you were using the administrator project in the URL, but that you had to provide a different one in the request. So that was weird. In this case, we wouldn't get it on the context, and because this could be a system scope, and we would only get it in the payload.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
I think, Orca, there is only one API, like get all default types, which uses the system scope, and others are for project and system admins both. So my doubt is, like, for a project admin, we can set the default type, but for system also, like, we need to use what Lance suggested, like pass the project ID separately, right?
Yeah, but the thing is that we may have to change that to adapt to the system scope mechanism right now, to the new RBAC, because a system scope would not. Because if I remember correctly, Rajat, I could be wrong, the project ID, when we set the default volume type for a project, we pass the project ID in the payload.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
So in a system scope, that could be fine. We don't have to change that, but our context would not have a project, and the URL that the client would be calling should not have a project ID as well. So it could look like we originally intended, which was without a weird project ID that is not used in the URL. We probably don't need, well, we may need to make some changes, but we have to look into that. But I thank you very much for the explanation on the different approaches. And I really like, I think you said the third one was the fifth one was the one that was like most liked.
Yeah, that one seems to have the most consensus so far, because it gives us some flexibility, and it's also really just 2 points that we know of so far that would really need to change. Like, we modify Keystone middleware to do this, handle this special case, and then we probably have to modify something in Keystone Auth to handle this too. So for example, if you wanted to create a server in a specific project as a system administrator, you're going to send a system scope to token and a project ID in this header, right? And it's going to get into Nova. Nova is going to build up a client to go talk to Neutron, and that client's ultimately going to be using Keystone Auth, and it's going to need to set that same thing. So that when it puts that request on the wire to go get a network from Neutron, Neutron also has that project to build that up or create that port binding. So, long story short, like the KSM bits, like the Keystone middleware bits, are going to be like the ingress. We prepare everything and then expose it on the context object ultimately through Oslo context, and then the KSA bits are like the outgoing. Like, well, we'd have to look into what we need there if somebody gives us a context object with system scope and project ID. Like, okay, we need to special case that, probably set it on the request in the same fashion, because that would ultimately signal that the context was derived from a system administrator passing in a system scope to token and setting the project specifically.
Yeah, we have those kind of cases in Cinder, where we receive the request in Cinder, we do some things, and then we make a request using that same context to Nova. So yeah, you're right. It would need to be preserved in that direction as well.
Yeah, so that would be hopefully just changes in Keystone middleware, Keystone Auth, and then we could start going through the clients and finding the places where, okay, we need to update clients so that system administrators can specify a project, right? Is there a relatively common place that we can do that, or is it? I'm not sure how much work that's going to be, but
yeah, I agree with Gorka. This sounds like the best approach. I mean, the other thing is it handles the reader nicely, which is like really important. But also the part of this is to try to simplify things from the operator perspective. So there's other approaches that require all the roles being lined up exactly right in all the domains. So yeah, I think this is good. Let's just stick with this one.
Also one more thing we discussed before, in resources, we use the context.project ID to we store it in the database. So that problem also gets solved with this.
So if I understand correctly, the next step here for Cinder could be to wait until these changes have been made to the middleware Keystone client to Keystone port and everything, and then look into adding it to the Cinder client and confirming that everything in Cinder behaves as expected.
Yeah, I mean, the Keystone middleware bits are really specific for using system scope tokens to work on project owned resources. So like if Cinder has other APIs though that are not project specific or whatnot, like there could be probably things to work on there and like while we're still working on the Keystone middleware stuff. And then I do have like a series of patches up that implement the project reader and project member stuff in for all the project specific APIs. Those are ready to go, assuming we work on some more tests. But
okay, so it's we have to review. I see the link. Yep, all those patches.
And then there's like the question of what we want to do with, because I mean, Cinder ultimately has a way to, pass in the project ID, and that can come from the path, right? And I think we have to figure out what we're going to do with that, because we're also like this fifth approach, this third client approach is actually adding another way to specify a project. So for Cinder, you've got it in the URL. You can have it in the token, and you can have it in this header, which again comes through in the token. So what happens in all of these different cases? Like if somebody's calling a Cinder API with a project scope token, then you should really just have to make sure that the context matches the URL project. And I believe Cinder already does that. And you throw a malformed URL if those two things mismatch and you're not an administrator. That would need to get relaxed in order to actually consume system scope, because right now I think it assumes that project ID is going to always be present. So if you take a system scope token and you try to give it to Cinder to do something, that'll break. So that's something I think we need to relax. And then in the other cases, like, what if an administrator sets the project ID in the URL and then sets that to be something different from what's in the header? What do we do there?
In that case, I think we would raise what we are doing right now, malform. This is crazy. Because having it in the URL, I think once we update the client, will mostly be for independent clients, curl request, things like that. So we expect our clients to do the right thing and not provide them inconsistently, right?
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
So then, in terms of allowing URLs without the project IDs, should we just regard it as malformed if you don't have if you're not requesting a system scope, if you don't get back a system scope token?
Can you use an example? Sorry.
Yeah, no. Well, it's for the case where I guess I'm thinking about this backwards. So if I make a request for a system scope token, I get back the Keystone catalog. It's not going to have a project ID in the URL. So then I make a request.
Yeah, right now, if you like deploy OpenStack and you set up your your Cinder endpoints, all of them have a project ID URL templating. And because system scope tokens don't have a project, that templating doesn't happen in Keystone. So your service catalog and your Cinder service don't have any endpoints. So you have a service, you have a Cinder service, but there's nothing, it doesn't point to anything. So I guess, yeah, we need to figure out what we're going to do with that, because you could either scrub the project ID from Cinder's entire API and just go to a non-project ID templated URL and then use that, but that would be probably a lot of work. Or we would add a non-project ID templated endpoint specifically for system clients. So then like your system users would get a Cinder client, it just wouldn't have the project ID on it. And then your client could append some garbage or like a Sentinel UUID, like the 0 UUID or something like that, as like a fake project ID. And so then when it, like the request actually hits Cinder, we don't hit 404s. Because
okay, thanks. Yeah, so the idea is we're going to keep the URLs the way they are. We'll just have this case where the client has to be smart enough to fill in the Sentinel. And if people are using curl, they just have to know to use a Sentinel to make the request.
Right, and
we can publish a Sentinel because they still have to make a request to Keystone to actually get a token to do anything. So just knowledge of what the Sentinel is isn't going to give you any power over anything.
Right, and that's kind of what Nova wants to do with like the list all servers with a system scoped token bit, is just use a Sentinel for what they log. So it's not the greatest, but at least it would be like a known value. Like, oh, this project actually doesn't exist in Keystone. This is a Sentinel that's aliased to system scope.
Should we make sure that the different projects use the same Sentinel, so we don't go crazy when looking at the Nova logs, Cinder logs, and etc.?
Yeah, I think that would really help with consistency and usability. I kind of thought about, like, because it seems policy related, I was wondering if that Sentinel should live in Oslo policy or something. But I don't know. We could do that.
But yeah, it would be nice if you could get it programmatically, because if it's a UUID, nobody's going to remember what it is.
Well, it's
because I think all zeros aren't a legal UUID. I think you got to have.
No, projects don't need to be UUIDs, if I remember correctly. You could write system scope in the project.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Or just OpenStack.
So we would do, I think what Nova wants to do is something like this. Like they would use a null, or not null, like a 0 UUID. So which is like specifically reserved. And we wouldn't like create that in Keystone. Like you can't generate that. So it's not going to conflict with anything. And so Keystone's obviously not going to create a project with that UUID conflicting, which is better than having like an operator go through and like set up every single service config with like, this is my super special UUID, which feels like it's a lot of hoops to jump through, and there's a super slim chance of like generating a conflict.
Right.
But
so then to address Gorka's point, which I just late in the
No, all I said was that.
Oh, right. They don't have to be UUIDs, but they can be. So this would be fine. Thank you. That's what I was going to say. Right. So you're not going to want to have a UUID, but
I think most deployments are using UUID.
Yeah. And this one would be easy to write alias to some symbol somehow on the client side, so you don't have to type this out all the time. But yeah, it's like, I think it's illegal UUID 5. So anyway, so it's perfect. Yeah, it's never going to get generated.
So I wanted to ask what will be the effect of this on Tempest? Like Tempest gets, I think, the base URL from the endpoint. So do we need any changes on the Tempest side as well?
So I think the Tempest work will be kind of what, so if you weren't in the session on Monday, we talked a lot with the Tempest folks, and they are going to try working on a test decorator that will swap the admin client with a system scoped client instead of the project admin client. And you can do that on a per test basis. So that would allow us to kind of work through all of the existing Tempest tests and reuse all of those tests for protection testing, which would be nice because testing this from the ground up is going to be an incredible amount of work. So Gansham has an action to work on a decorator that would check if system scope is enabled in Tempest for a service. And then if it is, set self OS admin client to OS system admin. Else, it's just going to be the OS admin client, which is the traditional, I have admin on a project. So I think getting around to your question, that will be like the first step in our Tempest changes. And then from there, it'll be going through every test. And then if there are system specific operations or system or project specific operations that we need to do with the system scoped token, we'll need to update the Tempest client to use this 0 UUID, right, to be consistent. So we could see some changes in the Cinder Tempest client to support this too. Because we'll need to teach the Cinder client what a system scoped token is, which I have a patch up for. I think it's marked as work in progress, but it detects if the token used in Cinder client is system scoped, and if it is, it appends some like a garbage ID on there, just so that the request actually makes it into the Cinder API without failing on a 404. So we'll need to make that same change in the Cinder Tempest client. And then we should hopefully just be able to use the credential sets that Gansham has already started working on, like where you can use the OS system admin client.
Okay. I think there's one more issue I was facing, but I don't need to stop it. So yeah, I think that's all.
Hey guys, I gotta run to get some lunch. I'll
Hey, good to see you, Walt.
see you guys online.
Good to see you. Yeah.
See you guys.
All right. So I think this is good. I mean, basically, I'm just gonna have to organize this work much better so that it's easier to pick up for people to work on it. But
I think most of the work right now is do reviews.
Yeah.
Do the reviews. I think that's at the point we are right now.
Yeah.
And look at probably the only request that could be system scope, which is related to the default volume types, to make sure that everything is going to work there, and then wait until the rest of the client and middleware stuff is ready.
Look, I looked into that code and I think there won't be any problem.
Okay. Good.
So just to confirm, we are not working on any new endpoint. use the parent endpoint and just replace the project ID with a fake ID, I think, for system scope tokens, right?
I think for the default volume types are the only ones defined to have no project ID in the URL.
Yeah, they are probably the only, well,
So maybe we'll have to put it back.
no, we have others. For example, get pools.
Oh,
That request makes no sense to have a project.
I thought
right?
I thought it had one though.
No, it has, but it's useless. You don't get
right,
because you're getting all the backends. This is a system. Actually, this is a system request, not.
So we have a bunch of those where you're required to have the.
But we are passing the project ID, but I don't think we're using it. So those are system requests. But as long as we do, like Lance said, in relax the check that we do to complain about malform URLs, I think those requests will be fine. But we do have a couple which are system scoped, basically.
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm trying to put this into work buckets, and it sounds like we have, like, we're going to need client changes, right? We'll have to make it so that the Cinder client understands system scope and populates this 0 UUID otherwise, right? That gets the request into Cinder's API.
Right.
That can be worked on in parallel with the KSM changes and the Keystone Auth changes. And then we have to relax the Cinder API to accept system scope to tokens, which I have a patch up for review. I don't know if it's good or not. I just kind of like hacked it together to get it to work, and like it worked in DevStack. So I don't know if it's good, but some eyes on that would be good. So those two things would be needed in order to get like system scope even consumed, right? Then at that point, like we can actually start writing policies that use the system scope attributes, right? Like we can actually start updating Cinder's policies, which I had started doing like last cycle before we started hitting some of these bits with the project IDs. But I had proposed all of the patches to like use system scope, and then realized that we had some more things to work through with project IDs before we could actually get that done. So once the client bits and the API bits in, I think we could probably revisit those. And then, for example, changing the volume API so that I can, as a system administrator, extend a volume for somebody in a project if I had to, or I could delete a volume for somebody. Like I could go clean it up using this new method where I'm setting this pass-through header. And like I'm using a client that sets the proper URL, right? And then we'd also need like requires a tool change to add a so we'd need a change to DevStack or triple O or OSA or whatever, so that all of those endpoints, like the system scoped tokens, actually get the Cinder endpoint. That before the
There is, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, there is other requests that don't use the project, which is get all volumes, which is similar to get all the Nova get all instances request, right? When you request all the volumes for all the tenants, that is a system scope request.
Sorry,
Get list volumes.
no, right. Right, but the way we handle it now is you have the administrator's project has to appear in the URL, and you use all tenants equals 1 or something to
Yeah, but the thing is that the all tenants, if we switch to say when we're changing to secure RBAC. So being an admin does not imply that you can list the volumes for all the projects that Cinder handles, because that's a system scoped request. So I'm a project, I am an administrator, but I am a project administrator. So if I say, give me all tenants volumes, it must fail. It must tell me, what do you mean all tenants? You don't have access to all the tenants. Either fail or silently ignore and just return the ones they can see. We can choose, but we cannot return all the tenants.
right.
yeah, that seems reasonable. Like all tenants, okay, here you go. Here's all the ones for your tenant. I don't know what other tenants you're talking about.
You're right. We've got to look through the API more carefully because that's hidden in a weird place in the query string.
And then what about currently the delete volumes and all operations like that are just checking for admin, right? We check the project matches. If it doesn't match, are you an admin, then it's fine. That changes completely now. So we have basically to go everywhere, check in the API where we're looking for administrators, operations, and tweak that to, probably we just need to create a helper function that says, is this allowed, or is him an administrator for this project or whatever, and there we check if it's a system scope user, if the context matches, if blah, 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 blah. But we have a couple of places where we can check is admin.
Well, see, I was thinking for the is admin check, we can still, if we check in when we set the context, we only set is admin true in the case where it's a system scope token, then we should be okay.
I want to say that property defaults to true, doesn't it?
I don't think so.
But the problem I see there, Brian, is that you can be a project administrator.
Right.
And you should be able to do,
Yeah.
or a domain administrator.
Well, but see, we're not implementing. We're gonna have to deal. That's going to be for Z.
Yeah, but if we already create the helper function or something like that, then we just need to add code there. If we do it some other way, then we will have to figure out another way to do it for the domain. So I'm thinking of just putting the pieces in place so that next steps are not harder. Because probably once we get this ready for the system scope, people will think that the domain is not that much work. So if we implement it with the minimum approach that we are talking now, then we are going to be tight for time on the next implementation.
So what I'm thinking is, right, the isAdmin is currently our check for a real admin, right? Like a Cinder administrator. So basically, right now, whoever satisfies, we only set isAdmin true for somebody who would be a system admin in the right in the scoped world. And then as far as like the project admin goes, that's going to be filtered out at the policy layer.
Not really, because if I understand correctly, a domain can have multiple projects, right? Or not?
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, but
so how will we be able to know if I'm the administrator of a domain and there are multiple projects? How will we, in the Cinder API code and everywhere, know if I am allowed to do that as an administrator of that? Because I will have, in that case, well, it depends on how we do it, really.
all right, we better, yeah, think about this more.
Yep. But yeah, this is sorry. You were saying, Rajat?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, like, what is the purpose of implementing domain scope? Like, we discussed this before, and we didn't see any use of domain scope in our like APIs. So,
Yeah, good question. We get this one a lot. Keystone uses domains as containers of resources, like users and groups and projects, but most other services like Cinder and everybody else really just bubble ownership up to the project. So consuming domain support out of Keystone would be nice for some use cases, but I don't think it's necessary right now. Like fixing some of the system admin stuff and forcing better tenancy is probably more of a pressing issue. And like the domain support would be useful for something like if you wanted to have someone similar to like an AWS account owner, right? Like that would be, in my opinion, the equivalent of a domain admin. So that person is able, like, because they have admin on that domain, they can create projects within that domain for their different, parts of teams, their organizations. They can create users within their domain. Like they can grant authorization on different projects within that domain. Like all of that stuff is supported as a first-class citizen within Keystone. But I mean, that's not to say that like that domain administrator couldn't just give themselves authorization on projects within that domain to go interact with things in Cinder if they wanted to, right? Using a flow that's already supported today. Where it would get nicer is if, as a domain administrator, if I could use my existing token and say, list all volumes, and like Cinder would give me all volumes for every project aggregated together. Like that would be the case, right? Or list all servers gives me all servers within the projects underneath my domain, which is going to require a lot of work on each of the services to understand what a domain is, query Keystone for all the projects within that domain, query their resources, filter them accordingly. And right now Keystone supports the ability to pass role assignments down in an inherited fashion. So it's really just one extra step for a domain administrator to go just get a token scope to that project and then list stuff or whatever. There's advantages to it, but there's also it's probably not the most pressing thing to focus on from a policy perspective.
Yeah, I'm considering the the changes that could require in Cinder to understand, because this could come all the way down to the database layer where we would have to group the projects and make the query saying if it's in any of these. I'm thinking that Brian's original suggestion for the complaint, well, the issue I was raising about the is-admin, makes sense to go, Brian, with your suggestion, which is basically setting only is-admin when it's a system scope request.
Yeah, I think that's the safest thing, and I think we may eventually find that. Yeah, I think it's going to be conservative is the key thing. I don't think we'll leak anything. Yeah. Anyway, everything's going to have to be refactored at some point, but maybe in AA. Geez. Okay.
But yeah, I think we don't need the helper.
Yeah, I think your point about people thinking, hey, domain, we can add that easily. At least Lance understands that it's a big problem. So that's good.
I wouldn't say I understand it, but
it's a big change. Okay. All right, cool. All right. Thank you, Lance.
Can I ask one last topic?
Oh, sure. Sorry, Rajat.
Yes, sorry. So I was looking into the user pattern and said like we need to create a new endpoint with this like zeros of like the UID in zeros, and then so is that it? Like, are we going to create this endpoint?
I think the idea was that there won't be that's never going to show up in a service catalog. But what's going to happen is if the client gets a request that doesn't have client gets a request from somebody with a system scope token, and they're not telling you that they want to deal with a particular project, then the client's going to fill in all those zeros. And then on the Cinder side, we're going to know when we see that, just to ignore it and to work from the context directly. And then if an administrator is writing Python scripts or something and using requests, they'll just have to know when they create a URL to hit Cinder, when they're doing one of these kind of operations, right, to put in the zeros. I'm sorry, that was like no help at all.
Yeah, so if we want to do a curl request, then we should know this endpoint for system scope request. You said it won't be visible on the catalog. So where exactly, like, yeah.
Yeah, I think I guess so since we're going to have a special endpoint, you need to have a special endpoint for when you're requesting system scope, because there's no project ID to put in the template. But could we template all zeros for that endpoint and just have it in the service catalog?
So isn't it similar to creating an endpoint without the project ID, like for system scope?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that if it's already there, then we don't have to put this extra client layer in.
Also, Lance faced one issue with these, like when Lance tested it out with two endpoints without a project ID and with the project ID, then the request would go randomly to any endpoint and it would fail. That's something.
Yeah, if like a project scoped client. So like if Brian is a project member and his catalog has 4 endpoints for Cinder, and one of them is the project ID less endpoint, and if his client picks that endpoint first, it'll fail. for the same reason, because it'll assume that the project ID is on that URL, but it's actually not, and so it'll 404 from Cinder. So we'll also need, I think, a similar case where Cinder client's going to have to understand, yep, this is a project scoped token. I'm going to make sure that, you know, the project ID matches the end of the endpoint URL that I choose.
Does that answer your question, Rajat?
Yeah, I would like we can see on the implementation. Like I get the theory part, but I'm still thinking like how it will be implemented. So yeah.
Okay. So I was thinking, so my understanding was that okay, so the endpoint create service center. So I'm sorry, I'm getting completely incoherent, but I thought there would be 2 endpoints in the service catalog. No. All right, so because the problem was that since we required a templated endpoint, when that endpoint is displayed in the service catalog, it won't have any actual URLs because the template fails or something. So we need to, so that would be for the normal Cinder service that normal people use, would have that situation for system admin. So the system admin is going to have to ask for a different service or be looking for a different service in the service catalog?
No, so there'll be a Cinder service in the catalog, and for system users, it will only have one endpoint.
Okay.
So there will just be one thing for them to use, and that'll be a project ID-less endpoint. It won't have a project ID in the path at all.
Okay.
For project users, Keystone grabs all the endpoints, and if it's project scoped, like if the endpoint has project ID templating in it, it'll add those endpoints into it. So project users will get the project ID-less endpoint in addition to the 2 or 3 other endpoints. So they actually get a superset.
Okay.
And the problem is if they pick if the client chooses the
wrong
one, it'll fail, or else the client has to be smart enough to detect that, oh, this doesn't have a project ID on the path. I'm going to append the project ID from the token that I'm using.
Oh, okay.
Which could make the client a little bit more resilient in the event that Cinder ever wanted to move away from, or like URL templating in Keystone.
Okay, I'll have to think about this some more because I'm having trouble I need to think about how that fits in with the pass-through proposal to get a project.
So in my opinion, the pass-through is more native and the ID on the path is not, from the perspective of consuming the context object.
Okay.
Right? Because right now, I don't think there's anything in Cinder that takes the project ID out of the URL and sets that on the context object, right? It just makes sure that it matches.
I think that's right, yeah.
With the project ID pass-through, once we land those changes in Keystone middleware, and your request goes through Oslo Context, that project ID is going to be there and it's going to be set for you
Gotcha.
automatically.
And we just pull it out as right.
So
context.
Anything in Cinder that uses the context.project ID will continue to work.
Okay. All right. I think that's good. Or at least I think I've absorbed as much as I can. So thanks, Lance. We will be talking to you a lot over the next few weeks to keep working on this. So
Yeah, that sounds good. I can try and write this up and then distill the buckets of work down into something a little bit more concise, and then maybe we can look at that again and see if that's something that we can actually achieve in Xena. But at least with initially, like, technically all the project persona work is like ready to go. Like if Cinder wanted to get like an early win, for example, and support the project reader, project member, project admin, as in like what project admin always used to be.
okay.
All of that stuff is pretty good to go. Just needs some tests.
So when you say what project admin used to be, it's getting a project token, but for an administrative project.
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And you have an admin role. Okay.
Right. So if Cinder wanted to like use those three personas, with the project admin still being the equivalent of God.
Right. That scares me, but okay.
I mean, the main thing on those changes would be really just adding project member and project reader support formally.
Okay.
And it wouldn't require a whole lot of other changes in Cinder, like infrastructure changes. Like, for the most part, if you take those changes and roll them in a custom policy file, they kind of work. Because Cinder understands project scope.
So what that would give us is, as long as, and this shouldn't happen because it's during the development cycle, but as long as you didn't assign an admin role to somebody who's just just intended to be a project person, the policy should still work the way they're supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, most of the
Yeah,
operators that I talked to today, even though Keystone has supported system scope since Queens, and even though like some other projects have rolled out those changes, like nobody's really using project admins yet, in the sense that they're giving that to end users. Like project administrators are still people who are administering the deployment.
the whole deployment. Okay.
Like that, I don't see that change actually happening until all the services fully adopt the system scope. We kind of step through that door together, and then operators can start enabling it all and then enforcing it. Then at that point, like they can start. Okay, Brian's the admin of a project, so I'm going to give him that role, and then Luigi's a member of it, so he's going to have a role in that project, and then they can start sprinkling more functionality across that spectrum and pushing more functionality down to end users directly.
Okay.
But I think we're still a little ways out from that yet. I think that'll probably be one of the last things to really get adopted is full project admin support, because it's so overloaded right now.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So then, good. All right. So we can. Right. Gotcha. All right. So your policy changes can be merged.
The project specific ones, any of the system specific ones are probably not worth merging until we get the rest of this stuff done.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Lance. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for the time. I know this was like 70 minutes of a lot of in-depth stuff. So again, talking about authorization outcomes isn't the most exciting thing. So I appreciate all of the all of the time and bandwidth.
It's like a real high stress situation.
Right. It's not like enabling is, cool new feature, and if it doesn't work, you can just shut it off. It's like if you screw it up, it's a
Right.
a 0 day.
So it's really exciting, no matter how you look at it.
Exciting in a bad way, like high stress, your feet sweat, constantly exciting.
Living on the edge, man.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm gonna stop the recording. So thanks, Lance. Thanks everybody for
Thanks,
attending
everyone.
the PTG, and
Thank you.
everyone.
Cinder meeting next week.